du développement.
Colleagues, we are here today at the fifth meeting of our committee. Pursuant to the motion adopted on January 31st, the committee is meeting on the situation at the Russia-Ukraine border and the implications for peace and security.
I would like to outline a few rules to follow. First, please note that screenshots or taking photographs of your screens is not permitted. Les députés et les témoins ont le
Members and witnesses have the right to speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately.
Participating in person, please keep in mind that the Board of Internal Economy guidelines for mask use and health protocols are in place. And as chair, I will be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting. And I thank you in advance for your cooperation. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. And when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. And when you're not speaking, please ensure that your microphone is on mute. And just a reminder to members and witnesses that comments should be addressed through the chair. Just before we go to our first panel, following on Mr. Morantz's comments earlier, I just want to verify briefly that it's the consensus of members that we extend the witness deadline for the Taiwan and vaccine equity studies that is currently slated for this Friday by 2 weeks to February 25th. Do we have unanimous consent from members on that change? Any opposition? Okay, seeing none, we've approved that change. And I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first panel. We have from Disinfowatch, Mr. Marcos Kolga, Director, from the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, Ihor Mikhalchyshin, Executive Director and CEO, and from Hermitage Capital Management, William Browder, who's also the head of the Global Magnitsky Campaign. Each of you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and the way it's worked well in the past to enforce this is to give you a 30-second warning in a very analog fashion through this yellow card. When you see this come up, you have 30 seconds to wrap up your comments, and that also goes for the question and answer period following. Without further ado, I would now like to turn the floor over to Mr. Kolga for his opening remarks for 5 minutes. Mr. Kolga, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished members of the committee, I'd like to speak to you today about the threat of Russian influence and information operations, known more broadly as cognitive warfare, and how Canada and our interests are targeted in the context of the crisis in Ukraine. Mr. Chairman, earlier this week, a Toronto bakery owned by a Ukrainian-Canadian family was vandalized with graffiti messages that said, F Ukraine and Canada and Russia as power. Police are currently investigating what seems to be a hate-based crime, but the messaging spray painted on the walls of the future bakery is consistent with anti-Ukrainian narratives promoted by Russian state media. Such attacks are the product of the Kremlin's cognitive warfare against Ukraine and more broadly, the community of Western democracies. Over the past 6 months, the Russian government's escalating tensions against Ukraine and NATO have been accompanied by an intensification of information warfare by Russian state media and the Kremlin supporters and proxies here in Canada. The same false Russian state narratives that emerged during the Kremlin's 2014 invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine have reemerged in efforts to undermine Canadian and allied support for Ukraine. Among these toxic narratives is that Canada's foreign policy is controlled by Ukrainian and Central and Eastern European diaspora groups. Conspiracy theories like this one have been deployed by extremists in the past to marginalize and silence other minority groups. Such conspiracy narratives threaten to delegitimize the status of Canadians of Ukrainian heritage by relegating their voices to a second lower tier of citizen, one whose voice isn't considered equal to other Canadians. The muting of this community in Canadian public discourse is precisely the outcome that Vladimir Putin seeks to achieve. Bill Browder, who you'll hear from in a moment, is a constant target of Russian state disinformation. A recent Russian television segment suggested that he masterminded the recent uprising in Kazakhstan. And while he was advocating for Canadian Magnitsky human rights legislation in 2016, Russian state media accused Mr. Browder of being a CIA agent in a twisted documentary dedicated to discrediting him and other Russian anti-corruption activists like Alexei Navalny. The discrediting of critics by smearing them with false labels is a Soviet-era tactic that has been resurrected by Vladimir Putin. During the Cold War, Soviet officials indiscriminately labeled those who resisted Soviet repression and occupation as fascists and Nazi sympathizers, a tactic reactivated by the Kremlin to discredit Ukrainian pro-democracy supporters and the Ukrainian community in Canada. Last week, a member of Canada's Parliament sent out a tweet repeating this claim, stating that Canada's recent announcement of a $120 million loan to Ukraine would go to a government run by quote-unquote neo-Nazi militia. This is disinformation. Ukraine's government is, of course, democratically elected, and its president is a member of the Ukrainian Jewish community. It's worth noting that the Russian government has directly funded extremist parties like the National Front in France, the League in Italy, Jobbik in Hungary, in Austria, and other groups. In the broader geopolitical context, Russian state narratives seek to undermine Canadian confidence in NATO and through that erode cohesion within the transatlantic alliance. These include false claims about a NATO commitment to reject the membership applications of Eastern and Central European nations in the 1990s. That false claim is being debunked by Mikhail Gorbachev, but is being used by Vladimir Putin as a pretext for his current escalation against Ukraine. Russian government disinformation narratives are often communicated through Russian state media channels that broadcast on Canadian-owned and controlled cable and satellite television systems. According to a 2017 report, Russia Today, known as RT, pays Canadian cable providers to carry their channel as part of their cable packages, delivering Russian disinformation into 7 million Canadian households. During the COVID pandemic, RT and Kremlin-aligned proxies operating inside Russia's disinformation ecosystem have promoted narratives that undermine trust in Western vaccines. They promote protests against government COVID protocols as righteous acts of civil disobedience. Indeed, even the Russian embassy in Canada directly promoted hesitancy towards Western vaccines on its website. Let me be very clear. The Kremlin's cognitive warfare does not genuinely share any ideology with any Canadian political party or movement. They exploit them. The pandemic has provided an opportunity through which the Russian government can manipulate Western societies and the tensions within them through conspiracy theories and anti-government narratives. The protests in Ottawa are no exception. They are also the targets of Russian state media platforms and their proxies. The concerns and emotions of Canadians who genuinely feel marginalized by COVID mandates are being exploited to further erode their trust in our governments, media, and their fellow Canadians. According to a 2021 Facebook report, Russia is the largest producer of disinformation on its platform. There are measures we can take to help support Ukrainian sovereignty and protect our democracy at the same time. This includes targeting Vladimir Putin's own wealth and the corrupt oligarchs who support and hold Putin's assets abroad, including the hundreds of millions stashed away in plain sight right here in Canada. A task force should also be created to develop a national cognitive defense strategy to help all Canadians understand and recognize the threat of foreign influence and information operations, and to provide resources to defend our democracy against them. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Kolga, thank you very much, and thank you for sticking very closely to the time limit. I will now turn the floor over to Mr. Mikhalchichin for 5 minutes of opening remarks. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation to appear here. This committee knows, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is the federation of Ukrainian Canadian organizations here in Canada. We speak on behalf of the community of 1.4 million. We're looking forward to that census number and hoping it'll be even larger. So I'm here to talk to you today about the Ukraine and Russia security crisis. So as you know, in February 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, and since then has occupied Crimea. Parts of the eastern Ukraine oblasts of Donetsk, Luhansk has continued to fuel a war in eastern Ukraine where over 13,000 people have been killed, 30,000 wounded, and 1.5 million internally displaced within Ukraine. In November of 2021, Russia has once again started to intensify troop movements near Ukraine's borders. A series of diplomatic discussions between the United States, NATO, EU states, Ukraine, and Russia have not yielded any concrete results or commitments from Russia to de-escalate aggression against Ukraine. The UCC and our community believe strongly that now is the time for Canada to act further to deter Russian invasion rather than wait for this invasion to happen. The most effective way, we believe, to deter a further Russian invasion is to take proactive rather than reactive steps. We welcome the extension and expansion of Operation Unifier, Canada's military training mission in Ukraine announced by the government on January 26th. In the long run, the extension and expansion of this mission will critically strengthen Ukraine's defenses. However, the threat of a Russian invasion grows every day, and the Ukrainian armed forces need our assistance further today. There are more than a dozen countries, including NATO allies of Canada's, which are supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine's armed forces in response to Russia's recent escalation of aggression and threats against Ukraine. The threat of invasion is severe, and Russia stands ready to invade at any time. Ukrainians are not asking anyone to fight for them, but they do need our help to defend their country against a colonial power seeking to reestablish its dominance. We know the government of Ukraine has requested such assistance from the government of Canada for defensive weapons. Second, sanctions, we believe, will deprive the Russian state of revenue from which to continue to wage war and will reinforce the message to the Russian government that the West is resolute in countering Russian aggression. The UCC urges the Foreign Affairs Committee to support further provision of defensive weapons and stronger sanctioning against Russia and its officials. We've conducted a public opinion poll, which we shared with members of Parliament from January 20th and 21st, that shows 3 in 4 Canadians support or are open to supporting Canada providing defensive weapons to Ukraine. The number of Canadians, which is 42%, who explicitly support the provision of weapons outnumbers the number of Canadians who oppose at 23% the provision of weapons by almost 2 to 1. As you've seen this past weekend across Canada, Canadians from the Ukrainian community in some 30 communities in all 10 provinces came together to demonstrate their support for Ukraine and for Canada to provide defensive weapons. From St. John's to Victoria, Canadians strongly supported this campaign, and it is incomprehensible to us why the Canadian government continues to refuse to join our NATO allies in this important step to support Ukrainian independence. A survey published on February 9th by the European Council on Foreign Relations found also that the citizens of Europe see NATO as the best organization, best positioned to defend Ukraine. 62% of respondents stated that NATO should come to the assistance of Ukraine if Russia were to invade. So just to sum up, I know that our next speaker will talk more about sanctions, but we believe, again, the implementation of stronger sanctions against Russia will have 2 effects: deprive the Russian state of revenue from which to continue to wage war, and reinforce the message to the Russian government that the West is resolute in countering Russian aggression. Personal sanctions must be broadened against Russian officials responsible for egregious human rights violations of Ukrainian citizens, and Canada should target oligarchs that are close to the Russian regime, wealthy business people who serve as Putin's regime's enablers and who have significant assets in the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michaltuchin, and thank you also for sticking closely to the time limit. In fact, you're slightly under 5 minutes. I will now turn the floor over to Mr. Browder again for 5 minutes of opening remarks. Please go ahead. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to address you this afternoon on the horrible situation in Ukraine. I'm here to talk about sanctions specifically, and as some of you know, I am the person behind the Magnitsky Act. Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer in Russia who was murdered on November 16, 2009. And after his murder, I was looking for a way in which to seek justice for him. The idea came about because there were no other ways of finding redress. And we came up with this idea of freezing the assets and banning the travel of the people who were responsible for his murder. I first took this idea to the United States, and in a truly bipartisan way, the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012 with a vote of 92-4 in the Senate and 89% of the House of Representatives. It became a law on December 14, 2012, and Vladimir Putin went out of his mind when this law was passed. In retaliation, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. And then after that, he put Sergei Magnitsky on trial in the first ever trial against a dead man in Russian history, and put me on trial as Sergei's co-defendant. We were both found guilty. Sergei, they couldn't do anything more to, but they sentenced me to 9 years in absentia and have been chasing me around the world ever since. They've issued 8 Interpol arrest warrants for me. They've gone to the British government on numerous occasions for my extradition. They've made death threats and various other things. And it's become a full-time job for a number of people in the Russian government to come after me. So we know with the Magnitsky Act that we've hit a nerve. We know that we've found something that they really care about. In fact, a nerve probably greater than any other nerves. Putin declared it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act and prevent it from spreading around the world. Why does Putin care about this so much? He cares about it because Putin is a kleptocrat who's stolen an enormous amount of money from the Russian people, from the Russian state, and from Russian oligarchs. He's probably, I would estimate he's worth $200 billion. But none of this money is kept in his own name. The money is kept in the name of people he trusts. I describe them as oligarch trustees. And so as we're looking around at this Ukrainian situation, and everybody is that there's so many different conversations going on to say, what do we do to stop Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine? And the one thing I can say is that we should come up with something that he cares about. And we know what he cares about. He cares about his money, and he cares about his money that's held through these trustees. And so as we're looking at policies, the one policy which I've been advocating for, I'm advocating for here right now, and I've advocated in the UK and in the US, in addition to what all the other military strategies and so on, is a policy of going after the individuals who hold his money for him. And my voice has gotten through in the UK, and it's gotten through in the US, and both countries have made statements in the last 10 days to say that they would sanction oligarchs looking after Putin's money. And it's very interesting because the statement that was made by the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss on Sunday, last Sunday, moments after that statement was made, was the first time that Vladimir Putin emerged to publicly discuss the situation in Ukraine. He had been hiding effectively, not saying a word about Ukraine for the previous month. And he finally came out because we finally hit his Achilles heel. And so as we look forward as to what to do about this situation, my prescription is to make a list of the 50 oligarchs, the 50 biggest oligarchs who look after Putin's money. And there's no mystery as to who these people are. Various people like Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who's in jail, and many others have made this list. And we hit these people with Magnitsky sanctions. We start with 5 before any invasion to show Putin we're serious. We then tell him he's got 10 days to pull back from the border. We hit them with another 5. And if he invades, we go after the rest of the 40. I believe that this would stop Putin in his tracks and he wouldn't invade Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all our witnesses for their opening statements. We will now go to questions by members. And the first set of rounds will be, there'll be 4 of them. It will be 6 minutes each. And the floor first goes to Mr. Morantz. Please go ahead for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. My first, through you, Mr. Chairman, my first question is to Mr. Browder. But before I get into my question, I just want to say I had the opportunity to read Mr. Browder's book, Red Notice. I recommend it to every member of this committee. It is an eye-opening account of the brutality of the Russian regime under Vladimir Putin, and it is an homage to Mr. Browder's friend and lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. I commend you for writing the book and doing all the work that you've done, Mr. Browder.
Thank you.
The first question is, I just want to get your view or opinion on the current Canadian government's its current record on the use of the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, or the Magnitsky Act. What do you think of the track record of the Canadian government to date?
So, can I speak, or is there more questions? Right.
You can answer that, and then I probably will have some follow-up questions.
Okay. So the Canadian Magnitsky Act was passed in December. I'm sorry, November of 2017, and I thought it would be a huge uphill struggle to get people actually on the list. But about 10 days after it was passed, the Canadian government sanctioned the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, the people involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, some Venezuelan bad guys, and some of the officials from Myanmar who were involved in the Rohingya genocide. And I thought that this was a really good sign, and Canada was off to world leadership in this sphere. There was one more round of sanctions. And then from 2018 until now, the Canadian Magnitsky Act has not been used. And I look at this and I'm quite frustrated and disturbed by this, because it's inconsistent with how I viewed Canada when I was going through the advocacy process. And it's unhelpful in the world if we're in a situation where sanctions should be done multilaterally. When the United States and UK and other countries do that, Canada should join. And there's a number of instances where other countries sanction very despicable people doing terrible things, and Canada doesn't join its allies. And I think that it should, and I think that this needs to be addressed going forward.
Thank you. And, we've had, firstly, I know you've described Magnitsky sanctions as, just paraphrasing, an Exocet missile directed right at the heart of the Russian oligarchs and Mr. Putin. Very targeted and specific sanctions, which is why I'm somewhat confounded. We've had global affairs officials before this committee, and they seem reticent to commit to using this legislation, but rather to fall back on the more general legislation with respect to sort of broad state-based sanctions. And I'm wondering, if you have any sense of why they might be leaning in that direction as opposed to using your very effective idea.
Well, I can't get inside the head of the officials inside the Canadian Global Affairs Department, but what I can say is that it's there's a lot of people in the world on the bad side of the ledger who don't like Magnitsky sanctions. It's a real black mark for somebody to be put on a Magnitsky list, and perhaps it's an easier, less controversial sanction to use. But I think that question is probably best addressed to the people who have been reticent about using it to understand what their thinking is.
Fair enough. Now, there have also been discussions in the media about the use of what's called the economic nuclear option, cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, the global economic payment system. I just wanted to get your opinion on that as a potential sanction as well.
Well, so the way I look at it is that that is truly the nuclear option. When that was used against Iran, it basically pushed Iran back to the Stone Ages from an economic perspective. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, should we use such a blunt instrument as a first choice, or should that be the last possible choice? Because it affects everybody in Russia, many of whom are just as much a victim of Vladimir Putin as Ukraine is and as we are. And furthermore, there's all sorts of economic repercussions that will happen in the West. If we don't allow Russia to use the bank payment system, how does Germany pay for its gas? And so I think that if we have another tool which avoids all this collateral damage, it goes straight to the heart of the decision-making system. It avoids hitting Russians. It avoids hitting ourselves. That should be used, and it should be used aggressively first.
Thank you, Mr. Browder. Now to Mr. Kolga, time permitting. Mr. Kolga, Ukraine has requested lethal defensive weapons from the Trudeau government. Many of our democratic allies, including the U.S. and the U.K., have granted this request and supplied these weapons. Why do you think there's this reticence within the Canadian government to provide the lethal aid that Ukraine needs to fend off Russian aggression?
Just a brief answer, please, Mr. Kolga, just in the interest of time.
Well, I can give a very brief answer. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I believe that you'd have to ask the Canadian government that question as to why they have not have decided against sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. As you mentioned, the United States, the UK have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, which are very close to the border and on the front line with Russia. They've decided to send lethal weapons. So it would be good if Canada coordinated with them and did the same.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Morans.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bandayan, you have the floor for 6 minutes now. Inaudible. Ms. Bandayan is on mute. I believe you are on mute, Ms. Bandayan. Very sorry indeed. That was the pleasures of Zoom. Thanks again to the witnesses.
Deep respect for your work. I have a number of questions for all of the witnesses, so to the extent that you can make your responses brief, I would appreciate it. Mr. Browder, how many countries have imposed Magnitsky sanctions since Russia increased its troops at the border of Ukraine?
At the moment, Magnitsky sanctions have not been used for this particular issue since Russia has put their troops on the border.
And do you believe that Canada should go out on its own? I understand that the UK and the US have indicated that they may one day look to this. Just by the way, as our Foreign Affairs Minister Joly said that Russia would face, and I quote, severe sanctions if it makes further moves against Ukraine. So I guess my question is, would sanctions have the same bite and the same deterrent effect should Canada impose them on its own at this point?
My recommendation is that Canada joins its allies, the United States and the UK, in proposing sanctions for Russian oligarchs. I've heard this terminology, heavy sanctions, coming from the Canadian Foreign Minister, which sounds good as a headline, but I think that she should add the word, and specifically, we're going to look at sanctioning oligarchs close to Putin. Those are the words that were said by the British Foreign Secretary and by President Biden. And I think it would have a very strong impact if Putin saw that all the allies were working together and there was no division in the sanctions or the language of the sanctions.
Why haven't the UK and the US done so already?
I believe that at the moment that they're looking at sanctions, the threat of sanctions as a deterrent. Although, as I said in my opening remarks, I think that there should be some small taste of the sanctions, because at the moment, Putin doesn't believe that any of us are serious about this. And until he sees that there's some seriousness, his calculation is that this will be like every other thing he's done, where there's been sanctions, but none that affect him personally.
Thank you. My next question is, I think I'll address it to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Good afternoon. I'm looking at a photo here published publicly on February 2nd. It is a photo of Ukrainian MPs holding up flags of different countries in their parliament, and I see the Canadian flag front and center. Could you give us a bit of background regarding this photo? I understand that it represents the countries that have helped the Ukraine the most.
I've seen the photo published as well. I believe there was a moment in the Ukrainian parliament where some, I don't know which exact deputies, but some deputies had organized that photo op. So I believe they were making reference to the Operation Unifier assistance that had been announced, as well as other aid from other countries represented there.
My understanding from our Defense Minister, Anand, is that Canada has currently 260 troops on the ground today in Ukraine conducting training missions under Unifier, which you've just referred to. Is there any country that has more troops on the ground at the moment?
I don't have an operational analysis of the American or British operations, but I know that Canada has traditionally been one of the largest contingents there. I think our main concern is, as good as Operation Unifier is, for their own safety, those troops will be evacuated as soon as an invasion begins, and that's, I think, the proper thing to do.
I believe the UK has just over 100 troops, in the United States about 150. Do those numbers sound correct to you?
I don't have any numbers on the other country missions, so I'm sure they're correct.
Thank you. And perhaps I'll turn to Mr. Kolga. I found it very interesting what you had to say about cognitive warfare and the amount of disinformation coming out of Russia. I wonder if you can enlighten us and Canadians as to how Russian disinformation is entering, Canada at the moment through which platforms or mechanisms. Mr. Kolga.
Well, thank you for so much for the question, Mr. Chair. there are several different ways that Russian disinformation enters into Canada's information space. One of the primary methods is through RT. This is a Russian state-owned news channel that's been broadcasting since 2005. It broadcasts what you could call news, but much of it, the vast majority, in fact, is Russian state propaganda aimed at advancing its interests. There are other state media channels that are also pushing this same sort of information into Canada. There's also a system of proxy websites, fake news websites, websites that promote conspiracy theories and such, many of which have been identified in reports that I've produced at DisinfoWatch. The State Department has also produced them. One of them is a platform called Global Research, which was identified by the State Department last year. All of these platforms have been active over the past 2 years promoting COVID conspiracy theories, vaccine hesitancy and such, and have been picked up sometimes by some mainstream media, some extremist media, in efforts to as they're pushing them to Canadians. And so it's primarily Russian state media that promotes these narratives.
Mr. Kolga, thank you very much. We'll have to leave it there in the interest of time. Merci beaucoup, Madame Bendayan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bendayan. Mr. Bergeron, now you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for being with us today. And I'm going to continue on the same lines as Ms. Bendayan. I'd say, Mr. Kolga, that first of all, I agree. It seems undeniable, indeed, that Russia is carrying out disinformation campaigns around the world, particularly in countries, Western countries. We saw in Germany that they banned the broadcasting of that station that you were just referring to a few moments ago. And I'll admit that I was somewhat surprised to hear you say that you presume that the occupation of downtown Ottawa could flow from Russian action. I must say to you that the last time I heard something as spectacular as that is when this committee was the victim of someone who passed himself off as a Russian cabinet minister. We were fooled. Now, you referred to a list of people that we should impose sanctions on under the Magnitsky Act. But this impersonator of Mr. Volkov implied that the Kremlin was fueling the separatist movement in Quebec. So I was gobsmacked to hear this. So when you are listening, to hear you talk about Russia being behind this occupation of downtown Ottawa, I'd like to hear what you base this on to make such a statement. It's so unexpected, is the least I could say.
Allow me to clarify. I don't believe that Russian state media is behind the protests, but I do believe that Russian state media and other foreign media possibly are exploiting the situation. What Russian state media and the Kremlin tries to do, they identify very divisive issues, and what they do is they exploit them in order to further divide Western societies. What we've observed over the past week is that RT, Russia Today, has been reporting positively on the protests. We've seen other proxy platforms doing the exact same. This legitimizes them and could perhaps help fuel them along, but it would be incorrect to say that Russian state media is behind the protests. They just exploit them.
Merci.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it was important. I'd like now to ask a question of Mr. Mikhailsichin from the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress. You also seem, and you mentioned it in your opening presentation, giving credence to the theory that there is an imminent new invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Mr. Kuleba, has asked us to not contribute to this escalation and through alarmist stories and talking about an imminent invasion, because that would undermine Ukraine's interests. And through this, we're playing Russia's game. And the Ukrainian president was saying the same thing, saying that there was no reason to state that a major invasion is being prepared. And so why, whereas Ukrainian authorities themselves are asking us to calm down the rhetoric, what are you relying on exactly? What facts are you relying on? It seems that it, in a sense, comes out of nowhere. The Russian troops have been on the border of Ukraine for months now, so why this theory of a new imminent invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
Well, thank you for the question. I base that assessment on the public intelligence data that the American government is making known in terms of the total number, which I believe might even be 140,000 Russian troops around Ukraine and Belarus and Russia and Crimea, occupied Crimea. I think we have to understand that the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. And in the case of Vladimir Putin, he has said on many occasions he had no plans to invade Ukraine. He had no plans to invade Crimea. He had no plans to invade Georgia. So I think it would be foolish for us in Canada and in the West and NATO allies to assume that Putin has 140,000 troops roaming around the borders of Ukraine with no malintention. So I would respectfully say that we should be concerned about the numbers, and the rhetoric of the Ukrainian government, I think, is meant to calm fears and economic panic of its citizens.
Bien sûr, mais si...
Of course, but if Ukraine is asking its allies to use calmer language, why do you think that we shouldn't respond to that request on their parts?
Well, I don't know what calmer language can be used to describe a potential invasion, other than to keep repeating the facts. I know that the Ukrainian government is facing economic pressures, and there are significant preparations in Ukraine in terms of civilian and defense potential scenarios, as well as with the UN on humanitarian and refugee scenarios. So I think it is only responsible to forecast the possible invasion scenarios and prepare for them. It would be irresponsible to pretend that the threat is minimized and that we could be caught off guard, as we have in many other times by Putin.
Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Bergeron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Application goes to Ms. McPherson. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also would like to thank all of the witnesses who have joined us today. I've learned a great deal today. I've learned from all of you before today. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us all. It's very, very important and a very pressing issue. I did want to follow up on some of the questions that my colleague from the bloc has asked about the disinformation that the Russian media is using to cause or to increase the conflict that's happening in Ottawa and in other areas around Canada with the convoys right now. So I would like to ask, if I could, Mr. Kolga, this week we've seen a former Ontario Conservative MP in the Ontario legislature interview with Russia Today about the occupation of Ottawa and spreading some very disturbing messages. He said that Russia News provides a platform for objective journalism where Canadian mainstream media creates fabrications. So this is an MPP, an Ontario MPP, that is actually saying that Russian news is objective, Canadian mainstream media is fabrication. As parliamentarians, what do we do about this spread of propaganda and misinformation?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I was also surprised to see that Ontario MPP appeared on Russia Today. I think it's the first instance of an elected Canadian official appearing on Russian state media. The fact that that same MPP tweeted that Russian state media was more trustworthy than Canadian media was also quite surprising and disappointing. First of all, tweeting that sort of a comment exposes his followers directly to Russian cognitive warfare. It sends them into a down a rabbit hole where facts no longer matter. I think those followers probably are having challenges with some of that already, and that tweet doesn't help in that regard. I've been warning about this, quite frankly, this problem since before 2014. When the pandemic began, we saw the types of narratives that I think we're seeing right now connected with the protests. We saw them emerging already 2 years ago. We were warned by the European External Action Service that Russia would be exploiting COVID and would be using it to divide us and polarize us. We've been seeing this all along, and now we're seeing the results of that to a certain degree, and much of that is organic. There are genuine frustrations in society, but these are the types of frustrations, the emotions that the Russian government, like I said earlier, exploits in order to further divide us. That is the primary objective of Russian state media, is to divide and polarize and undermine democracy. During this process, we can put a stop to this. This means, as I mentioned earlier, setting up a task force to address this, placing sanctions on Russian state media so that they're not allowed to use our airwaves to broadcast their information. Right now, RT is available on Canadian cable systems. Russian language state media is, so is Chinese and Chinese state media. We should be looking at all of these and cutting them off and limiting their opportunity to affect Canadian political debate. Yep.
Thank you so much. Well, and I have so many questions for all three of you, but I do want to ask some questions of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. First of all, I do want to just express I'm so sorry what happened with the bakery in Canada. I'm so sorry of all the examples that we've seen that have shown hate towards the Ukrainian community. I, as somebody who lives in Edmonton with a very, very large Ukrainian population, will always stand with the Ukrainian Canadian population, and you have my deep sympathy for what you and what people in Ukraine are going through. But I did want to ask, you're talking very much about doing actions right now before Russia has further invaded into Ukraine. And you've given us some rationale for why that is the case. What is the risk there, though? What is the risk of undermining our de-escalation and our diplomacy efforts if we are seen to be ramping up, arming Ukraine? What are the risks there? If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of information on that.
Thank you for your sentiments, and I know that you had a chance to speak with Mr. Jasnowski, and I know that's very much appreciated. I think we're seeing a situation where Putin is engaging in bad faith diplomacy. He's making outrageous demands about what he wants. He wants to rewrite the borders of Europe to his liking. This is not the kind of person with whom you can engage in real negotiations. And the negotiations he wants, frankly, would involve Ukrainian sovereignty and independence being negated. And it's on his path back to the USSR roadmap. So I think that I don't want to make light of any Canadian military contributions, but I think the U.S. and the U.K. have the most significant military, in NATO, along with France and Germany, and certainly, a Canadian contribution I think is meaningful, but it needs to be put in perspective of, I think for 2 weeks now we've had those other powers sending defensive missiles and things. So I think we're very much urging Canada to join our allies in this effort. I don't think Canadian decisions would put us in more significant risk than we have been already.
And the sanctions, again, you're looking for those sanctions to be implemented now, not implemented later, not wait until further invasion by Russia, but to have that happen now.
I think, as Mr. Browder said, Putin doesn't take these threats of sanctions very seriously. And so I think giving him a show of what this impact would be is significant and different. We've seen that he frankly laughs at the sanctions that are placed on him and his officials in other situations, and they haven't made a significant impact in the past.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We will now go into our second round of questions, starting us off with 2 rounds of 5 minutes each. Members, please keep in mind that we will likely not get through the entire second round, as we do have a second panel that's waiting for its testimony. But we will start with Mr. Chong, please, for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Point of order. Yes, Mr. Bergeron? I'm trying to understand what you're saying there. Are you saying that there will be 2 5-minute rounds for the government and opposition, but not to us? No, I'm hoping to get through the first 4 turns, and afterwards we'll go to the second panel. Thank you.
5 minutes, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to focus on Russia's disinformation warfare. Currently, RT, formerly known as Russia Today, the state-controlled broadcaster, is licensed by the CRTC to broadcast in Canada in both English and French. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Kolga, do you think they should have their licenses revoked or amended by the CRTC?
I think that the Ukrainian-Canadian community has collected significant evidence of hate-based messaging and disinformation that's being broadcast by RT. I think that information has been sent to the CRTC, and I'm not sure whether the CRT is actually considering revoking that license. I do know that RT is in a particularly unique situation in that where they are paying Canada's satellite and cable companies to carry their channel. They would like nothing more than for cable to freely broadcast their channel to all Canadians. I would suggest that perhaps the best way of approaching it right now is to place sanctions on RT for broadcasting disinformation and for attacking our democracy. Because I think that having the CRTC remove their license, I think that process would be long, perhaps onerous. And so
the federal cabinet,
probably the quickest.
The federal cabinet could issue a directive to the CRTC. There are parallels, in my view, between the two authoritarian governments, the 2 largest authoritarian governments in this world, Russia and China. There are parallels between their 2 state broadcasters, RT and CGTN. CGTN, the Chinese state broadcaster, has also been granted a license to broadcast here in Canada by the CRTC, and there is evidence that they are spreading Beijing's propaganda, and there's evidence that they are committing violations of international law by airing forced confessions on air, which is against international human rights law. I'll also add this, that in 2017, when a media inquiry went to the CRTC about RT, they indicated that they had not and were not reviewing RT's presence in Canada, despite the fact that at that time, U.S. intelligence agencies had identified RT as a propaganda tool of the Russian government, and despite the fact that French President Emmanuel Macron said that RT France was spreading disinformation. Subsequent to this, the U.S. intelligence community concluded in the spring of 2020 that Russia had interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election through various means, particularly through RT, and also concluded that Russia had interfered in Canadian democracy by targeting Canadian elected officials, in particular the current Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland. Inexplicably, to me, the Cabinet allowed the CRTC in August of 2020 to approve RT France to be broadcast over Canadian airwaves in a decision in their decision 2020-281. Perhaps you could comment on this inexplicable action on part of the government and the CRTC to allow RT France to be licensed in August of 2020.
Well, thank you for enlightening me on that fact. I did not know that this had happened. I'm quite frankly shocked when we see in Germany just over the past 2 weeks that Germany has banned RT German off German airwaves. They've also removed RT, the German service, off of YouTube and banned it from YouTube. And so the fact that RT France, the French service, is now being broadcast in Canada, I mean, that's quite surprising. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that whether it's the government that removes the license for these broadcasters, whether sanctions are imposed to ensure that they're not able to profit from their broadcasting here in Canada, whether it's on the internet or otherwise, we need to do something about this broadcaster and others like it, as you mentioned, CGTN, CCTV, foreign state broadcasters that seek to promote disinformation and propaganda on Canadian airwaves. We need to put a stop to it.
Mr. Colgan,
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Tung. We will now go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I begin by thanking our witnesses for your engagement with us today. All of you are helpful to us. I want to particularly thank the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. You've been persistent, consistent, thoughtful, and engaged from the beginning of this crisis with the government. And I recognize that this is an extremely difficult time for both your organization and your members. And to thank you for continuing to advise the government and being available when we've needed to talk to you. Obviously, no one in this room, and I'm going to start with a couple of statements and then a couple of questions. No one in this room is not touched by this because of the significant Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. We all have friends. This is personal for many of us. And that is a motivating factor. But the reason this is on the top of the agenda for the Canadian government is not only that. It's because a threat to Ukraine is a threat to the Western world, is a threat to Canada. And we will continue to see this as a threat to the international rules-based order, a threat to sovereignty and the integrity, the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And we are taking it, there is no foreign policy issue or defense issue that is more important to Canada at the present time. It's been a difficult time. I mean, I talked to Boris Jusnevsky as well after Future Bakery was vandalized, and that was a personal moment for many of us as friends of Boris's, but it was more than that. It was an expression of what I believe will probably be determined to be hate, and also probably an expression of disinformation or misinformation that needs to be adjusted. We have that, though, from members of Parliament as well, and I will not dignify the remarks by NDP MP Lee Gazan by reiterating them in this room, but I also think as Canadians and as parliamentarians, we were all deeply offended. I want to go to Mr. Kolga, though, about that, because one of my Ukrainian Canadian friends said that statement was founded in Russian disinformation, and it could be promoted or propelled into disinformation about the way in which Canada has engaged in terms of that $120 million sovereign loan and other engagements such as Unifier and the other many things that we are doing to support the situation. Could I ask Mr. Kolga to dig in a little bit on the way Russia could have promoted such disinformation and could take use of it in the future?
Well, thank you very much for that question. As a child of Estonian refugees who fled the Soviet occupation in September of 1944, I can tell you that my parents, who were infants at the time, would have been considered by the Soviet Union and by their propaganda machine as being what according to, similar to the tweet that you were referring to, that they were fascists or neo-Nazis, simply for escaping Russian occupation and repression. That line of propaganda was used throughout the Cold War to smear anyone who was critical of the Soviet Union and the occupation and repression of the republics occupied by the Soviet Union. That narrative has been resuscitated, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, by the Putin regime to label anyone who is critical of his regime. The problem with that narrative, as you might expect, is that it marginalizes those that are targeted by it. With regards to the Ukrainian community, the entire community is smeared with this paintbrush and is intended to silence them and stigmatize them, so that when the Ukrainian community speaks up, the hope is that these labels will stick to them and that the Canadian government will not pay attention to this community and their voice. So that's the core of the problem.
Sorry for interrupting, but is it possible then that Russia would use that to show division in the Canadian Parliament? I don't think there's anything that we're more united on, perhaps some outliers, than are concerned about this issue. Can Russia use that sort of statement to show some sort of lack of consistency?
Clearly, they have. I'm not sure about the intentions of the member of parliament who repeated that Russian disinformation in her tweet, but the fact that a member of parliament has tweeted that disinformation is truly it demonstrates that the Russian disinformation and propaganda is effective and is connecting with parliamentarians. That's a problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Colga. Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Two brief final interventions will take us to a full hour with this panel. And as I said, we have a second panel that's waiting to give testimony. Monsieur Bergeron, je vous passe la...
Mr. Bergeron, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes, and then Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes. Very quickly, Mr. Chairman, a question for Mr. Browder. In an article published on, I'm sorry, I don't have the site, sorry, in the Le Monde, the Russia is solid, and with their hydro and their gas and oil reserves, and they have $630 billion, and people are wondering on the usefulness of the suspension of the SWIFT system for them. So what do you think about these questions raised by people who claim that Russia is prepared for such an eventuality?
The Russians, there's probably no stronger moment for Vladimir Putin than right now, because of these figures you just cited, but also because of the timing. We're in the middle of the winter, and because Russia exports gas to Europe, and in the case of Germany, 40% of their gas comes from Russia. In the case of Italy and Austria, it's 100% of their gas comes from Russia. This is the moment that they have maximum possible leverage. And what that means is that the Germans and the Italians and the Austrians and others are going to do everything possible to break ranks with the Western alliance and not be too tough on Russia. And as far as the SWIFT sanctions go, you're correct that Russia has these enormous reserves, but that doesn't really matter so much if you're in a situation where you're basically cut off from the rest of the world financially. Your reserves will run down very quickly, and life will get bad in a very short order. And so nobody should underestimate the SWIFT, the effectiveness, or I should say the pain of SWIFT, but nobody should also underestimate all the collateral damage that it will do.
We have little time left, Mr. Browder, and I think it would be insulting to add another question to you, but thank you so much for your testimony. It's most enlightening. Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Ms. McPherson.
Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And since the comments or the tweet by one of the NDP has come up, I want to make it very, very clear that her tweet in no way reflected the position of the New Democratic Party. I've spoken to our leader, Jagmeet Singh, many times, and our support for the Ukrainian people and for Ukrainian Canadians is unwavering. I believe that Ms. Gazan has retracted that statement and
certainly it is something that I deeply regret and can reiterate our support for the Ukrainian Canadian people. My last question, though, I would like to ask, and I know I don't have very much time, but Mr. Browder, if you could talk a little bit about the other countries that have been using Magnitsky sanctions in a more appropriate way, that have been using them more frequently, and what you would like to see Canada do and what actions you'd like to see this committee move forward on. And I know that's a lot to ask in a short time, but good luck.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, Canada has only used the Magnitsky Act very briefly in 2017 and 2018. The United States has used the Magnitsky Act more than 500 times, and they've used it against all sorts of terrible villains all around the world. Britain has used the Magnitsky Act more than the Canadians, even though it's only been in effect since 2020. And so I'll make a pitch to this committee, which is that it raises a very, very important question. We have a tool, an excellent tool, this Magnitsky Act can be used not just in this situation with Russia and Ukraine, but can be used with China, it can be used with Iran, it can be used with Myanmar, it can be used with all sorts of different places. And there's so many victims screaming for justice where this can be used. And I think it's the if the government hasn't been using it, it raises a very relevant question: why and what can we do to make sure that this tool gets used in the future? And so, to the extent that people in this committee are interested, I think that a hearing should be held on the Magnitsky Act, and the hearing should be held to bring in witnesses to discuss the best practices in other countries. How victims have used the Magnitsky Act in different countries, and what recommendations could be made to make it a tool that gets implemented and used more properly going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Chair, point of order, please.
Yes, Ms. Bundan, please go ahead.
I do not want to mislead Canadians, and I believe this is very important. I raised the issue of Ms. Leah Gazan's tweet in the House of Commons, and that question was responded to by the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh. That tweet is still very much live. It has not been retracted, nor has there been an apology.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. The only reason that the tweet is still up is because she had added the retraction to that tweet. This is playing politics. Ms. Bendayan knows that very clearly.
Colleagues, I think we're getting into debate here. And as I said, we are waiting for another panel, but thank you both for those points. On our collective behalf, I'd like to thank our three witnesses for their time this afternoon, for their insights. We will give them an opportunity to disconnect. Please keep safe. And thank you again for joining us today. And Madam Clerk, we will then briefly sound check the second panel and resume shortly. So we'll be suspending for about 2 to 5 minutes max.
Thank you.
before the panel begins, so I don't have to interrupt them towards the end of the meeting.
Ms. McPherson, I think we have very little time as it is. This is a compressed panel, and we've agreed to take the panel on this afternoon, listen to their testimony. What is it a point of order you're raising?
It is the motion that I've brought forward that I would like to read into the record so that I can actually ask for unanimous consent on it. And it would only take a moment if to read it into the record, if that's okay.
Just from our exchange earlier with the clerk, I believe the motion is already formally moved, and therefore procedurally reading it into the record would not really have an additional procedural effect. You're welcome to use your allocated time. If that's procedurally correct, you're welcome to use your allocated time to read the motion into the record, but I believe you could speak to it at the next meeting because it's already been submitted. I'd like to just ask the clerk to verify. I'm just mindful of the clock, Ms. McPherson, and we have invited this panel, and I believe do want to move forward. Madam Clerk, what's the procedural status of Ms. McPherson's? If it's the same motion we're even talking about, I just want to make sure that it is. It may be a new motion, in which case it.
The motion to invite the ambassador to the UN of the United States to come to committee.
If, Madam Clerk, if we can just circle back and get the procedural effect of reading that into the record, does that add anything at this point?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Notice has been given to members of Parliament. At this point, it has not been read into the record. All that would do is make that motion then available to be seen publicly, but it would not be able to be debated.
Okay, which Ms. McPherson is free to do in her allocated time, I would assume, procedurally. Okay, I'm getting a nod. So, Ms. McPherson, I would invite you to use your allocated speaking time if you wish to make that statement on the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Just briefly to go back to the process, just to let witnesses know that simultaneous interpretation is available at the bottom of your screen by clicking the globe icon. You have the floor feed, you have French and English. Each of you will have 5 minutes to make opening statements. I'll be very strict on time, especially given that we are under compressed time frames this afternoon. What I will do is once you're approaching 30 seconds in your opening remarks, I will hold up this yellow card as a cue, and that will also serve as a guide in subsequent question and answer with members of the committee. Just keep an eye out. It's a very manual way, but it does seem to work at some level. Just be conscious of the fact that time is allocated very tightly. I would like to introduce our witnesses and then turn it over to our first speaker. We have appearing Anessa Kimball, who's Associate Professor of Political Science, Directorate Center for International Security, École Supérieure d'Études Internationales, Université Laval. We have Fen Osler-Hampson, Chancellor's Professor, Carleton University, President of the World Refugee and Migration Council, and we have Dr. Olga Oliker, Program Director, Europe and Central Asia of the International Crisis Group. Professor Kimball, I will give you the floor for your opening remarks of 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the privilege to share reflections on the situation at the Russia-Ukraine border. These remarks examine the role of international organizations, stakeholder commitments, and if institutions can return regional peace and stability, then close with some recommendations. On international organizations, I think it's fair to say that Russia with China will prevent action from the United Nations Security Council, and there would be a probable veto of the use of any sort of peacekeeping forces in the border area. The European Union right now appears to be working through Macron as its legitimate speaker, but it is struggling to maintain a common position. You just heard testimony about the pipeline politics, more or less. And so this essentially divides the U.S. from Germany and France and is also creating internal frictions. When it comes to NATO, Russia does not want it to be formally involved in what it sees as classically an internal historical issue. And so, of course, though the U.S. would prefer NATO's involvement for strategic reasons, Russia has called for a shift to the OSCE. In terms of stakeholder commitments, they are both risks and externalities, but also present opportunities. When it comes to sunk costs, Canada has its training mission in the Ukraine and Royal Air Force personnel based in Romania. Allied troops are in the east, serving as a tripwire and a risk for accidents. Hybrid war is on, including cyber attacks, information wars, and etc. The institution and other actors, such as NATO, have tied hands by giving an open door policy to Ukraine. Now, right now, we have a migration and human rights crisis. And while we're trying to prevent porous borders, territorial integrity is symbolically and functionally key given multiple risks working at the same time. And at the same time, NATO has committed to not reposition assets of mobile land-based strategic defense. Patriot THAAD systems are absent despite Russia placing Iskander missiles in the area. Their use by Russia would be a public gamble to up the ante and escalate. Russia prefers modifications without violence. For it, the threat of future strategic uncertainty is being perceived today as prohibitively costly, can force actors to negotiate. We talked a little bit about targeted sanctions. I see these mostly as a short-term punishment that Russia can mitigate by adjusting market size or price rather easily. And again, spring is arriving in Europe in the next few months, so its energy leverage will reduce. What we have seen is Russia's hardened the Ukrainian border with parts of at least 11 of its 13 armed armies deployed. Asking ourselves, shifting so many forces far to the west means it is comfortable with this much exposure to China in the east. How is this possible? Russia and China have a functional non-aggression act that's permitting them to split Western partner attention between securing the eastern border of NATO, which Canada, US, and partners have highly invested in both defensively, economically, and politically, versus attempting to deter Chinese irregular territorial expansion in Southeast Asia. Naval and air dominance are at risk in Southeast Asia. What we see now are large joint military and naval operations between the Chinese and Russians, indicating a growing functioning defense and security cooperation. Together, these countries are hedging against the US and the democratic order. They have resolved multiple territorial disputes over the last 20 years and deepened technical cooperation, creating what they called themselves a strategic alliance partnership, risking bilateral strategic vulnerability to each other to counter the US and the West. Russia benefits from Chinese economic investments, intellectual and human capital, while both advance their defense and security industrial sectors jointly. Importantly, they disagreed on aspects of the Belt and Silk Road Initiative, but it was a key security and economic integrator for both countries that resulted in regional and global defense security implications. And it was accomplished using informal means of cooperation. Right now, they have a short-term resolution to their joint commitment problem, which is to not fight each other and refrain from involving in each other's respective regional issues, while focusing on the independent but linked economic development and national security agendas. Russia sees China as helping prevent its decline by not meddling in Europe, while China appreciates Russia's tacit non-intervention in the Far East, both benefiting from a shared blindness to human rights abuses to ethnic and religious minorities. So what could the OSCE do? It is the only institution right now Russia is a member of. It can do conflict prevention, border crisis management, post-conflict rehab, also confidence and security building, but it's more of an exchange. It doesn't really have any meat. Accepting that Russia is an entrenched revisionist power facing a comparative decline and Ukraine is its chess piece on the board, the Minsk agreements are insufficient. Russia is excluded entirely from Minsk II. The structure and process could be rebooted, but requires redemarcation of non-militarized zones. Parties must commit to stabilize Ukraine's borders. While they offer direction, they're not implementable, requiring clarifications on obligations and increased commitments to monitoring by both third parties and implementation by all parties. Canada could leverage bilateral agreements, informal agreements with Ukraine and regional partners, collaborate on regional security, international stability, civil relations, democratic stability, human rights monitoring, increasing education and exchanges like government of World Affairs' own emerging leaders in the Americas program and other military training programs. Also, Poland and Turkey are increasingly key in the NATO-Russia-European relation in the near to midterm, and Canada should care about that. In closing, the decision of the U.S. to send troops to Denmark will not reduce Russia's perception of encirclement in the region. The Danes historically refused to host any NATO assets, recalling that among original partners, Copenhagen was closest to Moscow. This is a shift from their 7-decade-old position, a signal of contemporary insecurities. I can discuss the Americans in questions. Thank you for your time, honorable members.
Professor Kimball, thank you very much for your opening remarks. I'll now turn the floor over to Professor Hampson for 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pose 4 questions to your committee. Is Canada doing enough to deter Russian invasion of Ukraine? What do we do if deterrence fails? What additional measures should be taken to strengthen Ukraine's resilience, to reduce the risks of state and societal collapse as the crisis evolves? Finally, what should Canada's role be in strengthening arms control and confidence building measures to de-escalate the crisis and reduce the risks of military confrontation? We're currently in the pre-attack phase. Is there more that Canada can do to help Ukraine? Some argue that we should provide small arms, anti-tank weapons, which are sitting in warehouses originally destined for Kurdish forces in Iraq. Maybe. Cybersecurity assistance in cooperation with Estonia and the European Union is an option, but time is running out. As noted by your previous panel, we should also be ready for cyber attacks and social media disinformation campaigns that will be directed at us. What should we be planning for now if deterrence fails and there is some form of Russian incursion? NATO allies on the front lines will be asking for a lot more direct military support and assistance, especially the Baltic states. Are we ready for that? Europe, NATO, and Canada should be ready to handle a major refugee crisis, which in the worst case scenario could be 5 million forcibly displaced persons or more. How will NATO respond to Russian attacks against Ukraine's civilian populations that could kill tens of thousands of people? In previous crises, Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, NATO used its military assets to impose no-fly zones. That's not really an option here. When it comes to economic sanctions, there are financial sanctions against Russian banks, financial institutions, high-tech export plans, comprehensive trade and investment sanctions. But I would draw your committee's attention to FAAE, Foreign Assets Repurposing Act legislation, which is currently before the Senate of Canada, which is a form of Magnitsky Plus. Don't just freeze, but seize Putin and his henchmen's monies and foreign holdings and repurpose them to help his victims. And maybe that's an option that should be considered if he does attack Ukraine. Energy prices have skyrocketed. A Russian invasion of Ukraine will almost certainly lead to a further spike in prices, not just because of the cancellation of Nord Stream 2, but because major Russian gas exports to Europe currently transit through Ukraine. Canadian consumers will be affected at a time when central Canada is also vulnerable to supply disruptions if Line 5 is shut down by the governor of the state of Michigan, a perfect storm scenario. A Russian attack will be extremely damaging to Ukraine's economy. There's likely to be a run on the hryvnia and a balance of payments and fiscal crisis. Europe is also going to use Ukraine, I should say, is also going to lose major sources of revenue from the transit fees it gets from transporting Russian gas to Europe. Its healthcare and social service systems could also be overwhelmed. We will need to develop, if we're not already doing so, contingency plans by the IMF, EU, World Bank, other international institutions to help Ukraine deal with a severe economic crisis. And what's Canada going to contribute in this scenario beyond what we're already doing? What contingency plans are in place for a major humanitarian emergency? If Russia stands down, there's going to be a discussion probably about a new security architecture, and there will have to be a major commitment to new arms control and confidence building measures. Efforts to reinvigorate the NATO-Russia Council as a key forum for consultation and cooperation should be looked at. Canada played a key role in its origins and development. Many arms control and confidence building measures for Europe have gone into the paper shredder. Open skies, the INF Treaty, they will need to be resuscitated along with other confidence security building measures that would disallow military exercises near another country's borders. Historically, as you all know, Canada has played a critical role in building Europe's arms control and confidence building architecture. We will need to step up to the plate again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hampson, and thank you for being spot on with respect to timing. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Dr. Oliker with special thanks from the committee because you're connecting from Brussels and we know it's late evening your time. It's much appreciated. Dr. Oliker, you have the floor for opening remarks of 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the committee for having me. Thank you to the chairman, vice chairs, and honorable members for being here. So as I think you heard quite clearly in the last session, that escalated war is and remains very possible. Huge troop buildup, wide flexibility for Moscow in choosing what sort of operation it could pursue, supplemented by substantial naval presence in the Black and Azov Sea areas, though we have heard reports in the last hour that at least the missile exercise in the Azov Sea has been canceled. So that does not change the fact, even without the missile exercise, that Russia pretty much has Ukraine surrounded. If escalated war happens, Russia will win. More people, more weapons, more capable, more ability to send more stuff in. There is no amount of lethal or non-lethal aid that Ukraine's friends can send that are going to change that equation. There are weapons that can make it possible for Ukraine to inflict more damage. There are systems and tools that could help more Ukrainians survive. Those are kind of the options. They're not going to deliver victory. Once war begins, supply from abroad is going to become difficult if Russia continues to block access via water and flying becomes unsafe. There are two ways to prevent war that could actually work, that are pretty likely to work. One is to give the Russians what they want. The other is for NATO member states, including Canada and the United States, to pledge to fight for Ukraine. Neither of those are going to happen. The former, because what they want, both with regard to Ukraine and with regard to European security more broadly, is not acceptable to NATO or to Ukraine. The latter, because while a threat of larger war with more participants and a real risk of escalation, including to nuclear use, could well deter Moscow, those risks also are so high that NATO member states don't want to take them. So we've had these last 3 months of diplomacy in an effort to find a formula that creates enough incentives for Moscow to back down without undermining Western Ukrainian security or sovereignty. These aren't all carrots, of course. I think we've talked about this, that you've got this paired offer of talks about the fundamentals of European security, which Professor Hampson just talked about, with the threat of substantial sanctions and troop buildups in Europe, which have already begun. It's the right approach, but it might not work, in which case Ukraine will suffer first and most, but all of the rest of us, again, as Professor Hampson just said, will be suffering too. I want to talk briefly about why is Russia doing this, despite the fact that, of course, they say they're not, right, that the buildup is Western hype. But the diplomacy, which is focused on European security, underlines the reality that the challenge in Ukraine is part of the broader European security challenge of incompatible views of security on the part of Russia on the one hand and Western states on the other. That for Russia, 30 years of NATO enlargement and engagement near its borders are an effort, and often a successful one, to limit Moscow's capabilities and influence and to coerce it. And Moscow has never seen NATO or the EU as independent actors. It views both as subsidiaries of the United States. Ukraine has long been a red line for Moscow in this context, and while the 2014 war was spurred at the start by EU association, not NATO enlargement, and indeed NATO enlargement to Ukraine was not and remains not in the cards in the foreseeable future, Russia has since grown concerned, even more concerned, by Ukraine's growing ties with the alliance, which of course ironically were driven largely by the war. Russia had hoped that President Vladimir Zelensky, elected in 2019 on a peace platform, would implement the Minsk agreements, the ceasefire deals signed in 2014 and 2015 to end the worst of the fighting, the way Russia wants them implemented, such that it could cement its influence in Ukraine's east and give that east veto over foreign policy steps. But that has not happened. Instead, Zelensky is pretty much in the same place his predecessor was, with fighting at a simmer and negotiations at a standstill. COVID has now led to an almost complete halt of human and commercial traffic between government-controlled territories and not. Russia may well be thinking, have been thinking, that force or its threat could force Zelensky to back down, or that he could be forced from office and replaced by somebody more palatable, although the election of somebody friendly to Russia seems unlikely without a full occupation. In principle, a real deal on European security, and indeed on Ukraine, is in everyone's interests. It's a good thing even without the current escalation. Limits on deployments, activities, and exercises, and perhaps, yes, even some affirmation of the reality that Ukraine is not joining NATO in the foreseeable future, could very well make everybody better off. The efforts by NATO and Russia to deter one another over the last 8 years have led to increasing rates of incidents as forces exercise and operate in close proximity. A deal to end the war in Ukraine would save lives and livelihoods, but Russia may be waiting to see what it can get, and it might get greedy, particularly if it believes that sanctions can be weathered and Ukraine won't put up much of a fight, and Western buildups and sanctions will happen anyway. If it does agree to negotiate, it's vital that these negotiations continue, or more crises will recur. If we instead have more war, we are going to see more of these buildups and activities. We're going to see more increasing tension. We're going to see more crises, with each one more likely to lead to the escalation we all fear. And we should be prepared for this potential future as well.
Dr. Oliker, thank you very much for your testimony. The remaining time would allow us to go through 4 allocations of 6 minutes interventions by members, and the first of which goes to Mr. Abultaif. You have the floor for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the panelists. I think we've got 3 wonderful testimonies today or tonight, this afternoon. The situation out there is obviously very, very complicated and one of probably the toughest. It's a perfect storm on its own where so many factors can play. At the edge of it is the security, whether it's energy security or territorial security. And seems like this the situation escalates so quickly at the establishment of the second line of Nord Stream, which is Nord Stream 2. And for some reason, it just becoming an issue at all levels now. The Russians want security. They want to protect borders. They don't want Ukraine to join NATO. And then is even furthermore, they are to divide the Western world, to divide NATO over, talking to the Americans, not talking to the French, or talking to the French alone. With all this grim situation that we're facing, the question is on the pipeline. The pipeline Nord Stream 2 is, if that to stop, that is not good for Russia, not good for Germany, and not good for Ukraine. On the statistics, on the data, I would love to see Dr. Hampson or Mr. Hampson and Dr. Oliker, if you both be able to give us some feedback on that. Thank you. So maybe I'll start with Dr. Hampson.
Well, I was going to defer to Dr. Oliker, who's joining us from Europe as a matter of courtesy. So,
okay, please.
So I don't have statistics at my fingertips. I could probably find some and provide them. Here's a couple of things about Nord Stream 2. One is it doesn't exist yet, which means that Russia is doing a fine job supplying the energy it supplies to Europe without it. So it's part of Russia's plan for long-term energy supply to Europe, and that's why it's important. But not starting it doesn't actually change anything. It preserves the status quo. The other thing that's really important to remember is when Nord Stream 2 was first thought up, the idea was that it was a way to avoid transit through Ukraine so that German energy supplies would be protected from fights between Russia and Ukraine. The fact is, at this point, most of Germany's energy from Russia does not transit Ukraine. Over the time that Nord Stream 2 was in the works, lots of other routes have developed. So for Germany, at least, that's not an issue. For some other countries, it's more of an issue. So, it's really become much more of a political issue than not, which isn't to say it's meaningless for Russia. It's quite important for Russia or for Germany, right? There are sunk costs. People have put a lot of money into this pipeline. And for Russia, it is a big part of their model for how to supply Europe. But it has also, I would say, become more politically important than it is economically important.
Thank you, Dr. Hampson.
Russia currently provides Germany with about 40% of its hydrocarbon energy sources, oil and gas. The Nord Stream pipeline was originally intended to provide something like 55 billion cubic meters of gas to Germany. If you're an energy expert, you'll know what that means. I wouldn't consider myself an energy expert, so I can't tell you what that means, but it sounds like an awful lot of gas. The pipeline, can always be turned on in the future, right? You can suspend exports, say you're not going to take them, but that's always an option if things change. So that does give you, I think, important leverage vis-a-vis the regime, of course, Putin's regime. But it does mean in the short term, he won't get paid for anything.
So the President Biden and the American administration been looking for other sources of energy to basically replace if anything happened with the pipeline or the gas supply from Russia. How much you think this is going to change the strategy of Vladimir Putin, since he seemed to be playing all his cards at the same time without any indication which one will come first? And we're going to keep in mind for sure that the war is not to anybody's benefit, not now, not in the future.
Well, right now, the Biden administration is looking for LNG contracts in the Middle East, which is the nearest source of supply. But I can bet you that those countries are also coming under pressure from Russia not to enter into potential contracts. So, there's going to be a lot of pressure put on the Saudis and others not to play ball. I think we can all agree that they will get some gas, but it's going to be a lot more expensive, and it's going to be a lot more expensive for everybody.
Do you believe that it's too late, or it's running a bit late to try to find energy replacement sources or source replacement at this stage?
No, I do not. But I don't think it's going to be part of the bargaining equation with Putin if he's planning to go in at the end of February.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Abultai. Thank you very much. The next slot goes to Mr. Isasi. Please go ahead for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me to start off by thanking all the witnesses for their incredibly helpful testimony. Now, if I could start with Professor Kimball. You alluded to the fact that there are fissures amongst Europeans and North Americans as to the best means to assist the Ukraine. And I think Canadians, by and large, fully appreciate how incredibly important it is that there be cohesion, multilateral cohesion, to stop a Russian invasion. Now, as you know, our Minister of Foreign Affairs has been to the Ukraine and subsequently went to Europe to brief our counterparts. Same with our Minister of Defense. Do you think Canada is doing a good job liaising between the Europeans and the US and making sure that we're sticking together insofar as the defense of Ukraine is concerned?
I mean, I would say that in general, one of the issues is that it benefits Russia to try to engage as many different stakeholders as possible to try and kind of divide what would be different preferences over outcomes. And of course, the fact that there's the internal division within the EU regarding the gas pipeline itself complicates the situation because, the United and one other thing that we would notice for people, people that at least use formal models to study behavior is that Biden's rhetoric for a Democrat who generally would be viewed as pacifist has been pretty firm on this issue. And so I think that signals quite a bit that, at least in his mind, that, and I think that this also harkens a little bit to the intergenerational divide. We have Biden and Putin, who are essentially, they are old guard from the Cold War. And then we have Canada and Macron coming at it, very much representing this other, the next generation viewpoint, which is not necessarily couched in a rigid, bipolar structure. And I think that that's one of where kind of what we're seeing is this, a kind of a shared confusion about, to what extent this is, finishing up things with the Cold War versus, what extent Europe as an independent actor alone needs to come in and do something here. And the fact that the Europeans have not managed to create a solid, independent defense means that NATO has stepped in.
Thank you. Professor Habson, since we are focused on Canada's role, do you think that our government has been doing a adequate job making sure that all the members of NATO and other countries that are critical to this effort are speaking to each other and coming up with a cohesive plan amongst themselves?
Well, there's no question that in Brussels, there's lots of consultation going on, and we're part of it. My concern right now is that the Normandy group, led by France and its president, are conducting negotiations in an effort to revive some form, as we've heard, of Minsk I, Minsk II agreements that were negotiated under duress, that were ambiguous, sloppy, some would say, but it was a very tough negotiation. And I think I would hope that our prime minister is speaking to the French president and sending a strong message not to sell Ukraine out in those discussions. Because I think Ukraine is going to come, and its leadership is going to come under enormous pressure to go back to Minsk. And we've already heard how destabilizing that would be. It's not a pill that the leadership of Ukraine wants to swallow. And so, we shouldn't be giving away too much. And the message should be, don't sell Ukraine out, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you for that. Now, Professor Habson, your testimony was truly a chock full of information about various things that we should be mindful of. You did talk about the possibility of cyber warfare directed by Russia. Are we prepared? Are we doing a good job on that particular front?
Well, I think when you say we, Ukraine is getting...
As Canada, actually.
As Canada. Well, I think as you heard in the earlier panel, social media and other kinds of disinformation campaigns are already in full swing, and they're directed at us. They're directed at dividing us as a country on this issue, and they're Russian fingers there. They've been doing that for a long time, and my advice would be to speak to our folks in CSE and call them out, and do so publicly.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And I see the chair has put up the sign, and I'm almost out of time. Thank you.
Mr. Sassi, thank you very much. Puis-je passer la parole?
I'll now give the floor to Mr. Bergeron once again for 6 minutes. You have the floor, Mr. Bergeron. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to warmly welcome all of our witnesses and thank them for having taken the time to prepare these presentations that are very relevant and interesting. And I am thinking particularly of Ms. Oliker, Professor Oliker, who is presenting her perspective to us from Europe at quite a late hour. Professor Kimball, I'd like to start with you. I must say that I was quite fascinated by the presentation that you made, talking about the relationship between China and Russia. And furthermore, the former Prime Minister of France, Dominique Villepin, said recently that the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Games had left this field open to Xi Jinping and Putin to get together and get closer. So would you say that China is looking closely at the way that the West will react, or might, I should say, react to a potential invasion of Ukraine, in order to see if they might potentially be able to proceed with such an invasion of Taiwan? Thank you very much for the question, but I'm going to answer in English because I don't want to bother the interpreters too much. Oh, no, please answer in French. We have so rarely an opportunity to have a Francophone witness. All right, I will. That wouldn't bother me. Thank you. So that it's clear that for China, as for China, after the data we've looked at, that if China looks at challenges on the world scale and regional level, is that China is looking much and more to the international level. And so this is a comparison with Russia, which tends more and more to stay within its region of Europe. But for China, clearly, if they see that there's some kind of absence of a coordinated effort amongst the allies, it might encourage them to move more on Hong Kong and Taiwan than they have. So we have to take into account the relationship with the U.S., particularly in the region with Japan and South Korea, is not at the same level. So we can see that there's a bigger investment when we look at Europe and the whole panoply of defense and security there. So comparatively speaking, China is already in a region where there are fewer actors, and the ones who are there on the international level are not as powerful. So, for example, the ASEAN, other than that, there isn't really a strong identity of a group. So what makes a big difference with NATO and Europe, which has this identity, and also the capacity and the will to work. So even if Europe and the others want to create a defense identity, it's the whole aspect of the will to do something. I can see that there aren't players in Asia that are going to mount any great defense in an organized manner against China. So it's really Beijing's game to see what are the repercussions of the choices that we make, but of course with the subtext that they have to maintain their trade ties. Thank you, Professor Kimball. Canada doesn't stop saying that the alliance is united and that we have this united front in terms of NATO allies, in terms of Ukraine. But you must know that France and Germany have a somewhat different perspective in terms of Ukraine and NATO. President Macron went and met with President Putin a few days ago, and he admitted that the issue of the Finlandization of Ukraine is on the table. Do you believe that it is truly a possible scenario? And would that be potentially acceptable to Ukraine? I think that the Finlandization, that's a kind of a jargon keyword that even Finlanders would say, what's that? But in principle, it's the idea that can we really have a foreign policy of neutrality while maintaining some kind of guarantee of territorial security if we are right next door to a state that is a huge risk. So already there are certain challenges. In the case of Finland, they already have borders that are very stable. In terms of Ukraine, their borders are not as stable as those of Finland. So already that changes the thing, the story. Also, there's with Belarus. There are also Russian activities that are unfolding there and causing problems. So already the whole territorial defense, the natural territorial defense issue is less there. Ukraine is in a geostrategic area because it's between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and it's in that trade region that is also extremely important. And in Finland, well, they're less in such a corridor, so it means that it's easier to have that kind of relationship. What I've seen a lot is Moldavia, because they have neutrality, but they're also in the region, and they're very small. So that's another case of seeing how they manage to get involved in these discussions in such a hot region. So I think there are lessons that can be learned in the region, but I don't think, and I'm not certain that the Finlandization of Ukraine would be acceptable, and especially to Russia. Russia sees Ukraine as a part of its territory. it's like just an obstacle for them and it's a test of democracy, because their claim on the Crimean territory dates back 450 years. So we're latecomers to that. They see Ukraine as part of their territory. So trying to convince them is going to be very difficult. Thank you very much, Professor Kimball. I'll give the floor now to Ms. McPherson.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of the witnesses. This has been extremely informative and very fascinating for me. And I do apologize. I do just have to use a little bit of my time before I get back to questions. But I did want to just say that given the urgency of the situation currently faced by Canada and the reports of significant amounts of American money being used right now going towards organizers whose stated purpose has been to create their own government and dissolve the current one, I'm asking for unanimous consent from my colleagues to move and debate at the end of this committee my motion to invite the U.S. ambassador before the committee to address concerns of foreign interference. So I did just want to get that out there and ask for that unanimous consent if I could.
Okay, we will, is there unanimous consent? Just to not eat up too much of Madam McPherson's time. Okay, we don't have consent. Back to you, Ms. McPherson.
Thank you very much. So I will bring that forward to the next committee and we can debate it then. So I guess what I'm thinking about as I'm listening to all of this testimony, I might start with Dr. Oliker if I could. Is there we've heard all of the potential outcomes and the potential discussions that are happening. In your opinion, is there a diplomatic outcome to this crisis that you can envision that would be acceptable to Ukraine, that would be acceptable to Russia and to NATO countries?
So yes, absolutely. I think there is a diplomatic solution to this crisis that would leave us better off than we were before the Russian buildup began. The situation in Europe has not been stable. The European Security Order and the treaties that govern it were out of date and have started falling apart. We have had buildups and dangerous incidents even without this most recent one. So rebuilding a security order, having these negotiations is crucial. We've had a war in Ukraine for 8 years. Ending that war and finding a way forward is also crucial. So a diplomatic solution is the right way forward and is necessary. And yes, it is possible if everybody is willing to make some compromises. The challenge is that, at least from what we've seen on paper, there isn't that much room for compromise. The question is, for me, right, looking from the outside, is whether there are things we're not seeing that show more movement. For instance, the negotiators through the Normandy format have just walked out of the negotiating room after 9 hours together in Berlin. Now, before we get too excited, they spent 8 hours together 2 weeks ago in Paris and came out affirming their support for the Minsk agreements and the need for a ceasefire. So, we'll see if there's anything there this time. But yes, there is absolutely a way forward and a solution that is based on arms control, that is based on guarantees of Ukrainian sovereignty, that might in the end look something like a form of neutrality for all the many problems that has, one of them being that Ukraine was neutral in 2014 when the war began. It had non-block status in its constitution. And as Professor Kimball said, that Russia would like a vassal, not a neutral state. But again, negotiations mean everybody has to give. And if everybody's willing to give, there is a way forward.
There is potential there. Now, and I've been trying to get my head around this, and I asked people in our previous panel, but the idea of imposing sanctions, putting in defensive weapons, all of the things, and having that be something that would escalate the situation instead of de-escalate the situation, versus waiting too long until a potential further incursion into Ukraine. How do we find that balance between making sure that we still are giving as much room as we possibly can for diplomacy, for de-escalation, for a peaceful resolution? Because, and I've said it in the House of Commons, the people that will suffer if there is war are the Ukrainian people. It is the women and children in Ukraine. So how do we find that balance? Dr. Oliker, if you could provide some feedback.
So I think defensive weapons are not going to escalate the situation, particularly if they are, in fact, things that help more Ukrainians survive. Why would that escalate the situation? That's,
it wouldn't be seen by Russia as being
they'll make noise and they'll complain, but no, I don't think that makes the situation worse. And moreover, the Russians are building up. The Russians are still going to win the war, and they know it. I think there's a challenge with the weapons provisions that afterwards, right? If we do get a deal, we've got a much more heavily armed Ukraine, and we'll have to see what that means. But let's burn that bridge when we get there, right? In terms of sanctions and buildups, sanctions work best as a deterrent instrument when you don't have to impose them. If you start imposing them, you're imposing them as a punishment instrument. That tends to work great at sending signals that you're unhappy, but as we've seen over the last 8 years with Russia, it works less well in actually changing behavior. So there's very little reason to think that punishing them now with more incremental sanctions is going to change their behavior. The one thing that I would say is different from that is sanctions that are actually meant to stop a particular thing you don't want to happen, right? Sanctions that physically, change the equation, like anti-corruption measures in one's own country. I think those can be useful because they have an effect. The buildup is continuing, and that is something that's going on even now. The new forces being sent to Europe and around Europe. And I think that is a taste of things to come.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I think, Mr. Chair, that's my 6 minutes, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Yes, colleagues, we are at 5:30 or just after 5:30. I'm mindful of a potential interest to extend for no more than 15 minutes, but I'd like to do that by consensus because I realize that some members may have to travel. It's Thursday evening. I'm also very mindful of at least one of our witnesses being in the Brussels time zone. If everybody's okay to go to 5:45 EST, we could get in the first 4 segments of round 2. Is there any opposition to that? I'd like to do this by consensus. Seeing none, I will give the floor to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to explore the architecture and tools available to uphold the rules-based international order to contain threats coming from wayward states. And so I'd like to ask Professor Hampson about the idea of an international anti-corruption court. I know last fall, I believe you penned an op-ed suggesting that Canada should take the lead in the establishment of such a court. And so I have 2 questions I'd like you to answer. First, what role does corruption play in Russia's foreign policy? And secondly, what role could an international anti-corruption court play in countering Russia's threats?
So first of all, what role does corruption play? Corruption props up the regime and its leaders through their various offshore accounts and monies that they've hidden in various bank accounts in different parts of the world and different assets. We should, to come back to the issue of sanctions, put them on notice that we actually have tools. If FAAE were to be passed, that's the Foreign Assets Repurposing Act, that we can use against them to confiscate those sanctions. I mean, that would be sending a much stronger threat than just freezing. It's called freeze and seize. And I would say, you tell them you cross that line, it's going to hit you in the pocketbook. When it comes to the International Anti-Corruption Court, it's putting foreign leaders on notice if they're in fact prosecuted before the court, that if they step outside of their country, they will in fact be brought before the court and tried. It's often said that such an instrument, might be opposed, for example, by Canadian companies, Mr. Chong, but in fact, I think you'd find if you started canvassing them, they would see this as a great way to level the playing field when they do business abroad, because it's going to put foreign leaders on notice that they can't play these kinds of games. But I think, again, without getting into too many of the details, there are two potential instruments to use against corrupt regimes like the leadership of Russia. But it's going to take a long time to establish an international anti-corruption court. But we can do FAAE right now if there's the political will to do it. And I would suggest there's strong reasons to do it. And guess what? Other countries might well follow our lead if we were to pass such legislation sooner rather than later.
It was stated by our previous panel today that President Putin is worth $200 billion. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah, and it may be rather a conservative assessment, to be quite honest, because, we don't really know how much he has stashed away, but he's worth a lot, and it obviously matters a lot to him, and we should, put him and his henchmen on notice that we're not only going to freeze, but we're going to seize.
President, the previous panel also, Bill Browder on the previous panel suggested the government consider the following course of action, that the government identify the 50 oligarchs who hold President Putin's $200 billion in wealth and sanction an initial 5 right off the bat and impose a deadline for Russian troops to pull back from the Ukraine border. If that deadline is not met, to sanction an additional 5 oligarchs, and then to hold the sanction of 40 oligarchs in reserve if Russia were to further invade Ukraine. What do you think of that strategy?
Just a very brief answer, please. Thank you.
I think it's potentially a useful one, but you have to be careful about making threats that you're not prepared to carry through. And as he noted, we have not been particularly active as a country on the Magnitsky front.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Thank you very much, Professor Hampson. The next round goes to Mr. Sarai and Dr. Fry. We'll split the time of 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. This has been actually a very informative panel. Since I'm a little short on time, I'm going to try to be quick. To Dr. Olika, what's the level of Ukraine's preparedness in the Ukraine on their own? Did they stand a chance, or is it a really overwhelming situation for them?
They will lose a war against Russia. I mean, they are better prepared than they were in 2014, but so is Russia, and Russia just has more.
And so you think that without NATO, the Americans and others, they will not stand a fighting chance?
They will lose a war. I mean, there's no amount of supplies we can give them in the short term that is going to change that.
And what's your assessment of the EU's commitment or chances that they will be stronger in this in their support with Ukraine?
If Russia escalates, if Russia mounts an attack in any form, the EU will impose sanctions. I don't have any doubts of that they will take steps. I have no doubts that Nord Stream won't be turned on. All of these things. I also think the Russians expect all of that.
But they don't expect any military intervention from NATO or others. They're expecting sanctions. Is that your assessment of the situation?
They're expecting exactly what we told them: sanctions and a big buildup in other countries in Europe.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Dr. Olika. My next question is to Professor Kimball. What do you think the European Union and NATO, it's a similar question, will end up doing if Russia actually invades? Do you also have the same assessment as Dr. Olika?
Well, I mean, of course, the European Union is pretty much, it doesn't have very many other choices aside from putting sanctions up as its kind of first response. Now, NATO could do one of several things. There's a lot of risks in the sense that already NATO has deployed troops forward close to the border. And, you know, of course, there's a risk if, you know, Russia gets into Ukraine, it, you know, might start to get greedy. Right. And that greediness could obviously go to places like Georgia, where it also has other instabilities, or, you know, Kazakhstan. And so that would be a bit of another risk if they, you know, one issue is that they've effectively, you know, concentrated a lot of their military forces in the West. And, you know, like in the sense that they used Sochi to move down into the Crimea after the Olympics. As a board, you know, this could be something that they, you know, they decide to pivot, go somewhere else. I mean, their goal more or less is to keep the irritation high and to keep NATO in a situation where it prefers not to respond with violence because it doesn't want to look like it's escalating. Whereas this gives Russia a large amount of room to maneuver. Particularly because it doesn't have to, you know, it can use civilians, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to have soldiers that are identified as soldiers doing the activities. And that's something, of course, that, you know, NATO and other states, you know, they're not doing because, you know, they have to wear the, you know, the identification. So that's another thing that benefits Russia.
Just over to you, Dr. Fry.
Thanks very much, Wendy, for sharing your time. Very generous of you, as I know you to be. Anyway, I just wanted to say I've listened to all the questions over the last while since we've been doing this whole thing. I am very involved at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly level. And I just wanted to ask, because we've seen Minsk is the OSCE kind of table. Minsk has not worked really well since 2014. It's been kind of toothless as far as I'm concerned. So are we going to depend on Minsk? And if we decide to impose sanctions, is Germany going to join? Germany has shown a little bit of ambivalence, and I am hoping that they're going to join with us. But what about the other OSCE nations other than the European Union? Ms. Oelka and Professor Kimball.
And just a very brief answer, please. We only have seconds left.
So the Minsk deals are the deals that are in place, and a lot of the sanctions already on Russia are tied to their implementation. So getting rid of Minsk opens a pretty big can of worms. Figuring out a way to implement it and find kind of a middle ground is the better path. I am very confident that if Russia attacks Ukraine, Germany will implement a sanctions regime. I don't have any doubts of that.
Thank you. Very quickly, Professor Kimball.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, because it exists, Minsk is something that we're going to, that we want to try to rely on. But again, like I said, it's definitely not sufficient enough, and it needs more. It needs more teeth to it. And of course, one of the other issues is that, you know, the OSCE also has a lot of the other ex-Soviet states in there that are PFP partners, but not looking to join NATO. So this could tend to make the OSCE position a little bit closer to Russia's position than what it would be, you know, if it was maybe NATO, you know, negotiating or at the table. And so that's also important to keep in mind. But Poland.
Thank you. I'm sorry,
yes.
I'll have to cut you off. We literally only have seconds left. Monsieur Bergeron, 2 minutes.
Mr. Bergeron, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In any case, I'm going to go back to Professor Kimball to complete her answer. I'd like to talk about the imminence of a new invasion by Russia, because I had the opportunity to make reference to Global Affairs Canada statement in April last year and then in January of this year. And I have to admit, I wasn't convinced that the situation on the ground today is really very different from what it was last April. And yet, we keep saying that an invasion is imminent. And we're relying, I imagine, on information coming from American intelligence to draw this conclusion. So my question is a simple one. is this American intelligence reliable, or should we, as opposed to what was said in the previous panel, not see this rather as a propaganda exercise on behalf of the Americans, because they are supposedly using reliable information when they invaded Iraq. So how much can we really count on American intelligence? Oh, you are bringing some ideas in that are a bit far removed from this discussion, but I'll try. I think that American intelligence come through various sources, and so with technology there have been some advances and improvements on the American side in terms of the transition, and so we're crossing our fingers and hoping that we have good information here. But it's clear that for all of the observations of troop movements and so on, these are being supervised from satellites, and so the other side of the coin is perception. So what Russia wants to sell us is that the idea is that they're doing exercises, military exercises, and this is independent of what's happening because there's instability at their border. But on the other hand, what we're seeing are war exercises that are very large, and we wonder, are they bigger than what we might see as a problem? And we have to look what other actors are doing, as I said already. The fact that Denmark is beginning to feel less secure is something that we should look at with some interest from Canada's perspective, because historically they didn't necessarily want to get involved in all of these stories and accept American troops on their territory. And so they might be inviting Americans in a bilateral arrangement is an important signal. It might be that in NATO there are some fractures that are on the horizon. Thank you very, very much, Professor Kendall. Sorry. Thank you to our witnesses. Fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was fascinating, fascinating testimony. Dr. Kimball, if I could just carry on with some of the things that my colleague from the bloc has asked. You know, we heard today that Georgia, Kazakhstan, that there are other areas, now Denmark, that there are other areas that are potentially at risk if Ukraine is not able to maintain its territorial integrity. If there is an invasion, the Russia may have other goals, other places that they're looking at. Dr. Kimball, could you talk about that a little bit more, please? Could you talk about what the implications could be? Did I lose Dr. Kimball?
Already it's a region in which we find a lot of instability, right? Some of it is historic, but some of it is also brought upon by the actions of Americans and other partners in the region, right? One of the reasons why Turkey is not very content as a NATO member is because obviously they have had a lot of regional disruption with what's gone on in Iraq and Afghanistan. So already we have a general area where it's more militarized than it has been in a long time. And so already, you know, we're creating a situation in which there's a lot of risk. Now, the question also is, you know, it comes back to countries like Georgia and like Kazakhstan, if they have the domestic political resiliency to, you know, push back any sort of, and I think that's also where there are weaknesses. That those countries also face challenges, you know, in what we call, you know, the control of the monopoly of violence inside the country and stabilizing their borders. So we're already, you know, if we could be setting up, sets of states that are fragile for potential failure, this is something that we should care about. And of course, knowing that, you know, there are Canadians in Ukraine, right? This is a risk, you know, for Canada, particularly because there are actually Canadian, you know, citizens there, but also through NATO in some senses, you know, if NATO calls, Canada rarely does not respond, right? And I think that that is one of the things that is central to Canadian foreign policy. It goes in multilateral, and and NATO is one of its, one of the partners it's going with, most frequently these days. And so by implication, there's an interest to Canada. And the interest is not just, whether or not, our colleagues, our peers in Europe have big economic issues or face energy crunches or something like that. It's kind of the threat of multiple instabilities converging could really, lead to something that we don't want to see.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kimball. Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Colleagues, on our collective behalf, I'd like to thank our witnesses of the second panel for their testimony, for their appearance. Merci beaucoup de vos perspectives. Everybody, please keep safe. And with that, we stand adjourned until our next meeting. Merci beaucoup.